Thank you, colleagues. We'll move on now to the next item of business, which is a statement by Hamza Yousaf on the miners' strike review. The Cabinet Secretary will take questions following a statement. I would encourage all members who wish to ask a question to press their request to speak button, and I call on the Cabinet Secretary.
Presiding Officer, I am pleased to inform Parliament of the outcome of the independent review of the impact of policing on affected communities in Scotland during the miners' strike from March 1984 to March 1985. As members know, this was a bitter and divisive dispute. It's clear from the report that very strong feelings about the strike remain to this day in our mining heartlands. In 2018, the then Cabinet Secretary for Justice, Michael Matheson MSP, commissioned an independent review group to investigate and report on the impact of the policing of the strike on mining communities. The purpose of the review was to provide an opportunity to those who were affected by the strike to share their experiences as a means to aid understanding and reconciliation. And reconciliation will be a word I come back to throughout this statement. In this way, the review demonstrates Scotland's leadership in making sure the experiences of those affected by the strike are properly heard and understood. As you may know, this government has pressed the UK government to undertake a UK-wide public inquiry, which so far they have refused to do so. The report reflects the significant amount of evidence that the review group considered, including UK government cabinet papers and files, various academic papers and past reports on the strike. The report also draws heavily from the powerful testimonies heard during the review's public engagement events in former mining communities, as well as written submissions that they received. The evidence received through these processes has helped to bring openness, understanding and a degree of closure to all of those who contributed. I know the review group's report and the Scottish Government's response have been keenly awaited, not least by individuals and communities from our mining heartlands. That is why I'm pleased today to outline the Scottish Government's response to the report, which will also be published today. First of all, can I take the opportunity to thank the review group for their hard work and commitment in producing the report, ably led and chaired by John Scott, QC, Solicitor and Advocate, Kate Thompson, former Assistant Chief Constable with Police Scotland, Jim Murdoch, Professor of Public Law at Glasgow University, and former MP Dennis Canavan. The group took engagement events to the mining communities. They met with a broad range of people with many different perspectives, encouraging as many people as possible to come forward and to have their voices heard. They paid close attention to what they read, what they heard, and reflected the evidence with honesty and compassion in the report. I also want to thank the National Union of Mine Workers and the Retired Police Officers Association for their contributions to the review. And of course, my thanks go to the miners, police officers and other members of the mining communities who provided such powerful and personal accounts of their experiences of the strike. Although more than 3 decades have passed since the main miners' dispute, the scars from the experiences still run deep. The report indicates that in some areas of the country, the sense of having been hurt and being wronged remains corrosive, remains alienating. This was true for many who were caught up directly in the dispute, but also for their families and, as I say, for the wider communities to this very day. I was also, Presiding Officer, struck by the degree of commonality between miners and police officers when describing their experiences of the strike. For example, many miners and police officers were young men with families. They spoke about how frightened they felt at times on the picket lines and about their appreciation for small acts of compassion from those who were, on quote unquote, the other side. Turning to the report's recommendation, the report recognises that although the constitutional, legal and cultural landscapes have changed since the strike, the strength of feeling at the time of the strike continues to be felt, as I say, in mining communities to this very day. With that, the report takes the view that it is impossible to separate out the impact of policing during the strike from other key influences such as the National Coal Board and the criminal justice system itself. The report makes reference to the testimony of minors across a range of issues, such as state interference in policing, wrongful arrests, miscarriages of justice, and unfair dismissal. In particular, their view that the National Coal Board management in Scotland was unfair and inconsistent in its policy of dismissal, with many minors being dismissed for relatively minor offences. It is reported that in Scotland, 200 minors were dismissed. This is 30% of the total number of UK dismissals, at a time when Scotland's minors made up only 7% of the total number of UK minors. It is clear that a sense of unfairness remains. In adopting a truth and reconciliation approach, the report makes a single recommendation, and that recommendation is, and I quote, "Subject to establishing suitable criteria, the Scottish Government should introduce legislation to pardon men convicted for matters related to the strike." End quote. The report states that the pardon is intended to provide redress for minors who suffered disproportionate consequences for taking part in the strike. The report indicates that a positive step should be taken to recognise this, and that there's a moral responsibility on the state to provide something proportionate back to the minors to aid in that reconciliation effort. The report also suggests that the pardon could be granted on the same basis as the Armed Forces Act 2006. This pardon scheme recognised the exceptional circumstances under which World War I soldiers were convicted of offences such as cowardice. The scheme did not quash convictions nor create rights, entitlements or liabilities, but it did offer restoration of dignity to deceased soldiers and indeed comfort to their families. Presiding Officer, having considered the matter very carefully, I can confirm today that the Scottish Government accepts the recommendation in principle and that we intend on bringing forward legislation that will give a collective pardon to minors convicted for matters related to the strike. In the spirit of reconciliation, the pardon is intended to acknowledge the disproportionate impact arising from minors being prosecuted and convicted during the strike, such as a loss of their job, and to recognise the exceptional circumstances that gave rise to the former minors suffering hardship and the loss of their good name through participation in the strike. This is and will be a collective pardon, which applies posthumously and to those living, and symbolises our desire as a country for truth and reconciliation, following the decades of hurt and anger and misconceptions which were generated by one of the most bitter and divisive industrial disputes in living memory. The Scottish Government will right the wrong done to our minors. In taking forward the recommendation, there are, of course, some matters to work through, not least the detail of the pardon scheme, such as the qualifying criteria. In so doing, the Scottish Government should not be seen as casting any doubt on decisions made by the judiciary at the time, or as seeking to place blame on any individual or group of individuals. In terms of next steps, Presiding Officer, today's statement marks the beginning of a new phase of activity in relation to the miners' strike. The next steps in this process will be for me to consider carefully the criteria that might apply to the pardon scheme, so that we have a rationale which is well thought through and informed by the views of stakeholders. I said before a moment ago that this will be a collective pardon rather than one which requires an individual to make an application. This is because we recognise the difficulties there may be for some in sourcing the records to enable an individual to make a robust case. Therefore, we must take the time to explore the issues associated with the granting of a collective pardon and take a view on what would be reasonable and ethical. In due course, primary legislation will be required. In bringing forward the legislation, this government will be sending an unequivocal message to all of those who have been disproportionately affected by the events of the strike. And what we will be asking Parliament to do is to recognise the hardship and loss of dignity suffered by affected minors. In bringing forward a bill for a collective pardon, we hope to bring a degree of closure and a restoration of dignity for a number of minors their families and their communities. In addition, I can also confirm that, of course, I will continue to press the UK Government to hold a full UK-wide public inquiry into the events of the 1984-85 miners' strike. To bring the statement to a conclusion, Presiding Officer, the strike was divisive in many ways, with miners and police officers finding themselves in extremely challenging situations, and with police and community relationships coming under what can only be described as unprecedented strain. In welcoming the report and accepting the single recommendation in principle, I recognise that policing has moved on considerably since 1984-85. Serving communities lie at the heart of modern policing, and the review will help to ensure that value of community policing is even more firmly embedded in current practices. Finally, I encourage people to read the report, consider it with an open mind, that what we want is a real legacy of this strike to be. We want it to be reconciliation between police officers who are upholding the law in circumstances of a scale that they'd never encountered before, and to miners who are protecting not just their jobs, their way of life, but also their communities as well. And we can help undoubtedly together to heal the wounds of the past and recognise that between miners and police officers there was that thread of common humanity. Indeed, I'll leave you with a couple of quotes from those involved in different aspects of the strike. Firstly, this quote from a police officer from a mining community himself. He says, "I was brought up beside miners all my life. I had nothing but respect for them, doing a very dirty, very dangerous job. It was a hard job. That view has not changed of the honest, hard-working men I met and knew. And it is, Presiding Officer, only right that I give the very last word to a miner. We were not on strike to have a fight. We were on strike for our lives. The 1972 strike was a strike about money. This was about our jobs and about our communities." Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary. The Cabinet Secretary will now take questions. Liam Kerr to be followed by Neil Findlay. Liam Kerr.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and I thank the Cabinet Secretary for advance sight of his statement. And I acknowledge his careful but thoughtful and well-chosen words, particularly towards the end of the statement, where he rightly highlights both the police officers upholding the law in exceptional circumstances and the miners protecting jobs, their way of life and their communities. With that in mind, I also acknowledge the calibre of the review group and their full and comprehensive report. A matter such as this, with such a degree of nuance and need for understanding of all the facts and all perspectives, required nothing less, and as the Cabinet Secretary rightly says, merits reading. Now, colleagues will explore the many issues throughout this afternoon, so I'll confine myself to three simple questions. Is the Cabinet Secretary reassured that enough police officers were spoken to during the review, given the interim report noted that very few attending the public meetings identified themselves as retired police officers? Secondly, what does the Cabinet Secretary anticipate to be the timescale for the primary legislation, given that the current pandemic and the crowded timetable between now and dissolution? And finally, will the Cabinet Secretary seek the views of the police and miners' representatives when formulating the criteria for granting a collective pardon?
Cabinet Secretary.
I thank Liam Kerr for his questions and his comments about the statement as well. They're much appreciated. In terms of police officers, I spoke not just to John Scott, and I can tell you he did everything that he possibly could in the review group, certainly did everything they could to try to make the atmosphere as welcoming to all contributions possible. And that can be difficult because I know from the miners that I spoke to, and I suspect others across the chamber will say the same, that the feelings are still very raw for a number of miners, and therefore passions can get quite high. So I took the time to personally talk to the Retired Police Officers Association and some individual retired police officers who were involved in the strike at the time. And I have to say I found their testimonies very powerful as well. Many of them, one retired officer I can think of in particular, was close to tears when he was telling me that some of his family didn't even speak to him because he had to go on the picket line, police the picket line. And when he joined the police, that some of his family refused to speak to him. So I heard some really powerful testimony from police officers. So that is captured in the report, and I think if Liam Kerr, when he gets a chance to read that report, if he has any further concerns, he can of course bring those to me. In terms of legislation, it will not be for this parliamentary term. I suspect that will be incredibly difficult to do with the crowded legislative landscape that we have, not just in relation to COVID, but what was announced in the programme for government also. But that time period between now and dissolution will give us the time to work through what would be, for example, the qualifying criteria and so on and so forth. And I think in relation to his third question, I can just give him a very brief assurance that when it comes to working through that qualifying criteria, that legislation, then we will consult as widely and broadly with those that have been affected as best we possibly can.
Thank you. Neil Findlay to be followed by Bruce Crawford.
Thanks very much, Presiding Officer. I've campaigned on this issue for most of the 10 years I've been in this Parliament, but that is absolutely nothing to the 36 years of campaigning by former miners and their trade union. And the release of the Cabinet papers under the 30-year rule and the information that came out of the Hillsborough inquiry were the game changers in this campaign, confirming the long-held view that the miners' strike and arrest during it were politically motivated miscarriages of justice. Scotland was the scene of one of the biggest mass arrests anywhere in the UK, with 300 arrested in one day at Steps in Lanarkshire. And the Cabinet Secretary is right to say that with just 7% of the workforce, Scottish miners made up 30% of those dismissed after arrest. Most of these were trumped-up charges of minor breaches of the peace. And that affected people by they lost their jobs, they lost their redundancy, their livelihoods. Many were blacklisted, many never, ever recovered. Presiding Officer, I'm delighted, proud, I have to say moved that the pardon scheme that I put to the review has been accepted and accepted in full. And I want to give my unequivocal thanks to the panel, led by John Scott, and to the previous Justice Secretary, Michael Matheson, who met us, who listened to us, and who took the bold move to initiate this inquiry. And can I also pay absolute tribute to the Cabinet Secretary for accepting the recommendation of this report in full. From the bottom of my heart, I say thank you. The demand for justice does not diminish through time. Today shows us that determined, dogged campaigning works. And I hope that this decision today will put pressure on the UK Government for a full inquiry into the events at Orgreave and the policing of the strike in England and Wales, because burning injustices will not go away. Presiding Officer, to enact the pardons will require legislation. The Cabinet Secretary, will he agree to meet with party representatives to discuss how we could expedite this before the end of this Parliament? Because the numbers get fewer every year and time is of the essence. Finally, Presiding Officer, if the pubs were open, I'd be going for a pint tonight, but I'll have a few beers at home instead.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, I mean, it would, Presiding Officer, be absolutely churlish not to recognise the enormous effort of Neil Findlay on this issue. He has been a dogged and ferocious campaigner for the rights of miners. I read his article on the weekend about his own family's history within the mining communities. And as I say, it would be absolutely churlish not to put on record his own very considerable efforts. And I know, having spoken to the miners on many occasions, in fact, just merely about an hour ago, how thankful they are to Neil Findlay for being a close ally and close friend. So I think it would be appropriate to put that very firmly on the record. In relation to his questions and comments, I agree with his concerns around the political motivation and interference by the UK Government at the time in relation to the strike. We heard very powerful testimony about those concerns, and I echo his calls, and this Government continues to push the UK Government for full inquiry. And of course, in any way that we can make that case and even team up and ally ourselves with mining communities in England, then we're happy to do that. In terms of legislation, I'll take him up on his offer to meet cross-party to see if there's any opportunity to bring this legislation forward. What I would say to Neil Findlay, it is important we work through the detail. I understand his urgency and his need, but I can also assure him, because I know he's not standing again, if I'm not mistaken, that even if it is in the next Parliament, I'm certain that his efforts and his contributions to that legislation, we will still be listening to what he has to say in and around that. But I take his offer up, and I will meet with party representatives in that regard. But again, I think it would be only right, Presiding Officer, to put on record my and the Government's thanks to Neil Findlay for his efforts in this regard.
Thank you very much. I'm conscious this is a very emotive subject. However, I'm also conscious that we now have 8 minutes to get through 11 potential questioners, which we're not going to do. So I would encourage everyone to be as succinct as possible. Bruce Crawford to be followed by Margaret Mitchell. Bruce Crawford.
Cabinet Secretary, I very much welcome your statement today. Particularly, it will bring forward legislation to give a collective pardon to convicted minors. Minors at Paulmays Pits 3 and 4 from Fallen in my constituency were the first to strike, the last to return, despite the hardship and provocation endured. Sadly, many of these good men have died and won't witness this important day, but I know their families will be very proud of them. But would the Cabinet Secretary agree with me that it's the unsung heroes of the miners' strike were often the partners and families of the striking men who were wrongly convicted? They too showed courage and fortitude. Speak to miners and their families today, and they would contend they went back to work unbroken. Thatcher and the Tories badly underestimated the resilience and solidarity of communities like Fallen. President Officer, can I also sincerely thank John Scott QC and Dennis Canavan, who is a constituent of mine, as well as other members of the review team for doing such a magnificent job. Cabinet
Secretary.
Well, I'm pleased the member mentioned Fallen. I was reading an extract of a book from John McCormick about Fallen and the role that those miners played. As Bruce Crawford says, they went out 3 weeks before anybody else and they returned a week later. I think they had the record, if my memory serves me correct, of being out for 56 weeks. In total. So yes, they are the unsung heroes, undoubtedly. I agree with the points that he makes, and I also add to his thanks, my thanks to John Scott QC, the review panel, but particularly former MP Dennis Canavan. And what I will say is that when it comes to that political dimension, we will continue to press the UK Government in terms of their role in the miners' strike 84-85.
Margaret Mitchell to be followed by Alec Neil.
When considering and setting the criteria for the collective pardons scheme, can the Cabinet Secretary offer any reassurance to police officers who may be concerned about any potential consequences?
Cabinet Secretary.
No, they shouldn't worry about consequences. That is not the aim and the purpose of bringing forward a collective pardon scheme. Is about aiding that truth and reconciliation. I have spoken to the Chief Constable about the review as well. He will be putting forward a comment on behalf of Police Scotland, but certainly he is very welcoming of the review group and has made a commitment to work and for Police Scotland to work closely with us on this work where appropriate. Again, I understand, of course, Margaret Mitchell will not have had the chance to see the report, but John Scott does go into some details on what he thinks should be the qualifying criteria, and I think that's probably a good basis for us to start discussions.
Alec Neil to be followed by Ian Gray.
Presiding Officer, can I say, as the son and grandson of miners and as an MSP who represents the former mining community in Adrian Shorts, I welcome both the report, congratulate and I very much welcome the statement from the Cabinet Secretary today. Can I ask him two questions which arise? First of all, I accept that this is a collective pardon and I understand the reasons why, but can he confirm if the individual criminal records of the people being pardoned will be corrected and will have any conviction deleted from them? And secondly, will he use what devolved powers he has and try to influence the UK government to ensure that all powers of the state are used to ensure that never again should any group of workers be treated in this disgraceful way simply for exercising their right to strike?
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, if I take a second question first, of course I'll push the UK government in that regard, but I can give a commitment from the Scottish Government that actually the structure that we have of policing now through the National Single Police Force, the SPA, that actually affords a degree of independence, of course, operational independence between government and policing, and in particular operational policing. So that is precisely the reason why we have the structure of policing we have here in Scotland, to ensure that there's not that political interference in operational policing. In terms of his first question, it's a challenging one around criminal records because going back 35, 36 years, it is unlikely that the criminal records will be around for many of those who are convicted of, for example, bail of breach or indeed breach of the peace type offences. It's unlikely that those records will exist, and therefore if we put the criteria forward for the collective pardon that there has to be a criminal record, many minors would lose out on that collective pardon. Notwithstanding that, I'm happy to look at the issue of records, what records do exist, what records don't exist in the police system, but the police tell me at this stage, in terms of the criminal history system, something called the 40-20 rule would apply. So that means that once a convicted person reaches the age of 40 and the information has been on record for at least 20 years, then their data will be removed from the criminal history system. So therefore, many of the records of the minors will have been removed. That applies to a non-custodial sentence, I should say. So the criminal records issue is one that we're exploring carefully, but it is quite a complex issue.
Ian Gray to be followed by Mark Ruskell.
Thank you very much. The many ex-miners I represent will be absolutely delighted with the Cabinet Secretary's statement. But I say to him in all sincerity, they won't understand why we can't move to the legislation in the 5 months remaining to this Parliament. They know that we cannot, in all certainty, bind a future Parliament, and they know how many of their victimised comrades have already passed away in this long way. We can, when we wish to, legislate quickly. So I say to the Cabinet Secretary, will he seriously consider how perhaps that could be done?
Cabinet Secretary. On the basis that I will undoubtedly incur the wrath of the Minister for Parliamentary Business, I absolutely will take him and Neil Findlay up on the offer. In all sincerity, I would love to be Cabinet Secretary to bring forward this legislation, lead this effort. And he's right, we should never be presumptuous about being able to bind a future Parliament to our decisions. So in all sincerity I will, but I think also, I hope in all sincerity he will recognise the enormous pressure there already is in parliamentary business, not just with COVID, but some of the other announcements that have been made about legislation coming forward.
Thank you. Mark Ruskell to be followed by Willie Rennie. Mark Ruskell.
Can I warmly welcome the collective pardon and pay tribute to the dignity and the determination of the mining communities to see justice done. The report acknowledges that this injustice went beyond the individuals arrested and that women and their families in mining communities carried a very heavy burden in the years ahead. So what programmes can I put in place in communities such as Falin, Alloa, Lochgelly to continue this reconciliation work into the future and educate the next generation about the struggles of the past, but also their rights today?
Cabinet Secretary.
Yeah, I lost some of what Mark Ruskell said due to technology, but I agree with his point that the government continues to work with mining and ex-mining communities and some of the ones that Mark Ruskell mentions to make sure that, one, that history is not lost, that education of that struggle that the fathers and forefathers went through is not lost. And anything further the government can do in that regard, certainly I am more than happy to engage in that conversation, as I know my colleague who I spoke to before the statement, the Cabinet Secretary for Local Government, is also very keen to be involved in that discussion too.
Thank you. Willie Rennie to be followed by Annabel Ewing.
For the vast majority, the only conviction they ever had was during the miners' strike. Those are the words of former miner and Labour MP Davy Hamilton this morning. Many have now passed away, but their families are still there. This rights a wrong from grossly excessive punishments. And I want to add my support to Neil Findlay's call for a UK-wide initiative on this. And I'd be interested to hear from the Minister what discussions he's had with the UK Government on that proposal and what the chances are of success.
Cabinet Secretary. Well, on the second point, I suspect he'll know the answer to that. I'm not holding my breath for a positive response, I'm afraid, from the UK Government, but that won't stop us from putting the pressure on. What I was doing was waiting for the review group report to be published. It has now been published, and I will take those conversations up very much with the UK Government, as much as my predecessor did in previous years as well. But just on the latter point that Willie Rennie makes, I'm not sure that there will be much success in that, and perhaps we can look towards our colleagues in the Conservative benches to see if they can join and exert any pressure that they might be able to bring on the UK Government. His point is a very important one, the first point that he makes in his contribution. And in the review group report, he will see that some of the qualifying criteria that John Scott QC lays out include people who have not had hadn't had previous or indeed subsequent convictions. And I think that is a good basis to begin to start some of this conversation.
And Annabel Ewing.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I too very much welcome the announcement by the Cabinet Secretary today, and I absolutely praise the work of the John Scott Review Group for the excellent report that they have prepared. Can the Cabinet Secretary provide some assurance that he will approach the setting of the proposed criteria for inclusion in the collective pardon in a sympathetic manner, seeking to be as inclusive as possible? For that will be so very important, in particular for the families of those minors who sadly have passed away and for their communities, including in my Cowdenbeath constituency, where the attack visited on minors and their families by the Thatcher government is still felt so very deeply to this day.
Cabinet Secretary.
Well, Annabel Ewing articulates herself and her point extremely powerfully. I will be, of course, very sympathetic in terms of my consideration of a broad qualifying criteria. We must also accept that there has to be qualifying criteria. And the John Scott Review Group report does give us a good basis to look at. There's a number of qualifying criteria that he suggests that we look at. He says that the relevant offences should be restricted to breach of the peace or breach of bail relating to the strike. The person had no previous and no subsequent convictions, and that their case was disposed by way of a fine. I think that's a good basis to start from. We may want to look at whether or not those parameters are the correct ones, and I'll, as I say, engage in a very sympathetic way with an open mind, as Annabel Ewing requests me to do so.
Thank you very much. I'm very conscious this is a powerful, emotive subject which a lot of members are engaged, and a number of members who have waited patiently to get their comments and questions on the record. However, we have run out of time this afternoon. There's a lot of business. Apologies to Gordon Lyndhurst, to David Torrance, Christine Graham, Claire Baker and Claudia Beamish in particular.